The question is, if I recall correctly, you found in your heritability analysis stronger effect for females than for males after going an out environment, and similarly in your preliminary evidence for a specific locus, it looks like the female evidence is stronger. So I wonder whether you see this as possibly an imprinted locus where mothers are passing some aspect on to their daughters more than to their sons.
The maternal component, the way we do it here, does not rule out mitochondrial effects or imprinting. But because we know the mother, the social world of the mother has such a strong influence, and females stay with their mothers for life, I tend to blame it all on the social environment. But it is hypothetically possible. It would require some molecular work that's beyond what my group has tried to do.
My concern was just with regard to the last point that you made. Given, as Rob pointed out, that your grooming measure doesn't differentiate receipt and production, donation of grooming, could it be that there are, say, phenotypic differences unrelated to behavior between various alpha males? Some guys are sexier than others, and so they're groomed more than others, and they have greater reproductive success than others. And so you're not really measuring the reproductive consequences of something like the ability to successfully form social relationships in males, as much as you are just another aspect of female choice.
Definitely a possibility, and even though we're not quantifying it here, it's my belief that female choice is very important in who becomes alpha, and the females assist males that they like in rising in rank, and once the male does rise in rank, the females bond with him and sit with them and groom him. And so just having a better personality in some other regard that within the alpha, there's a variation in alpha, who's the alpha? I mean, they're stuck with the best of the possible choices. So yeah, it could be that.
Suppose it was just he has nice
fur. It could be that.
Suppose it's just, some alphas have nice fur, and it's a signal of a good immune system, or nice combination of alleles or what have you. And so, because he's got nice fur, females want to groom him more because he's somehow just attractive. Doesn't have anything to do with his behavior in other sense.
This is definitely possible, but there are also males who don't act right, who other animals tend to avoid them more. They're not as attracted to have relationships with them because they're not as attractive. They don't get it quite right. And so that's part of the package of sociability, is being able to respond right as well as to initiate right. But I completely agree with you. If it's just a physical characteristic that is driving the whole thing, these data don't rule that.
Well, let me follow up on that, because if it is a physical characteristic, which is a fascinating idea, it's of course much more likely to have a genetic basis. And in one of your comments that some males don't get it, it seems to me that the failure males, quote unquote, might in fact be a profitable area for looking for traits, because loss of function, loss of things is probably easier to pick out than gain that do it well.
Yeah, right.
And you have the data, I suspect, because you know the relationship of all these males to each other. So you can run that and check out to see the heritability of either the possibility of fur or the possibility of not making nice.
Yeah, and we actually have more of the typical focal animal type data on a subset of these animals, but not enough for genetic analysis, but enough to flesh it out qualitatively.
Can you either demonstrate or imagine any disadvantages of higher levels of sociability? And I ask because if it's fairly heritable and if it's all good, then you wouldn't expect the persistence of heritable variation.
Mm-hmm. Well, the argument is that it takes time away from resting, takes, that's the ecological argument that significant time is spent in tending social relationships.
So then you might not see that effect because they have no ecological pressure. The chow is just put out there for them.
Well, but for example, it wasn't correlated with the measure of impulsivity, the approach to the stranger, right?
Right.
If they're payoffs to being bold sometimes, then bold guys win some of the time, and nice guys win some of the time. But you can't be bold and nice.
They weren't negative.
Yeah, you can be bold and nice, but and it's true that our adolescent in the home group measure of impulsivity predicts dominance attainment 2 years later. So that is a component of who gets to be high ranking. Then, by virtue of being in that position, they're all better than the losers at receiving, being attractive social partners. Some are better than others, even within the alpha, at being attractive social partners. But it could be just how cute they are.
So first of all, I'd like to set the record straight, which was your idea to look for functional consequences of sociality when I talked to you about the baboon work I was planning. So I would like to point that out.
Okay.
It really was your idea to begin with. But secondly, I'm interested in this measure that doesn't seem to correlate so well. So this and this is sort of related to some of the conversation, this initiate social approaches. Do you think you're not seeing that as, I'm wondering, is that not significant because males have very, very low rates of social approaches, so you don't see much with that measure? Is it correlated with the other measures? And so I'm just curious how that measure behaves.
Within this adult male group, it's being attractive that is what it is that we're measuring here. I could, and there's different times of life. The older you are, the more you receive approaches. The younger you are, the more you initiate approaches. So this is not a factor. This is not 2 measures that go together. It's more a construct over time. But within this group, I could pull it up right now.
But
and
when
answer the
you
question.
combine these into a single measure, if say one of them were negatively correlated with the other, then combining them together would be problematic. And also, if there's not,
It's more that they're neutral. They're less positively correlated. Groom, and if I remember right, I could pull it up, is significantly correlated with receive approach, and it's lower with initiating approach.
but I was wondering, so
For adult males.
right. I was just wondering whether or not you could, looking at that measure, which does seem independent, is a more sort of independent measure of the sociable inclinations of males. So males can make themselves sociable by being good partners, being good recipients, or by being, kind of the cheery guy who likes to go over and sit near others. If there were any other ways to measure that might generate a more nuanced signal, that might not be able to pick up some of this other, other aspects of the males' motivations to interact.
Right. Well, the initiating approach didn't correlate with range, and it didn't correlate with paternity. When we looked at as a separate.
Right. So the other question is, do you have any data, can you look at how long males maintain the alpha position?
Well, they maintain it for the most part as long as we leave them in. And there are, actually I looked at rank change because there are a few cases where there was a change, a rank change from one year to the next. And they weren't particularly informative. Sometimes it was caused by the luck of the draw in a fight that injured the other guy. Or one, a couple of year period veterinary decisions to take animals out at a different threshold than.
Because given the funny biology of vervets, it could be that being sociable and being attractive as a social partner, either as an initiator or recipient, that might be another way where it pays off, because you're able to maintain that position.
Well, it could be, as Dan's suggesting, it could be all the females that are just kind of making this guy the one, and
Right.
and he's not blowing it. So, I mean, and this analysis does not separate that out. Now, I forget how if aggression relates to paternity, independent. I have to check to see how aggression relates to paternity. I do not. Aggression relates to rank, but I do not believe it relates to paternity at all, even whether you as you're separating from rank. But that's something I have to check. I've been sort of wading through this data set through the last
The whole thing is very.
couple of weeks, but and figure out if there's anything here. One of the things that I do find interesting is how bound together being a social partner and being high-ranking are in this species. So much so that it's difficult to separate out a sociable component above and beyond a rank component. They really are the guy who's in the middle of the room with females sitting near them.
They're not designed for statistical convenience, but it might be a good system.
Did you measure any morphological traits to look at, like body size, weight or something?
Yeah.
Are they correlated with rank?
I haven't analyzed them, but we definitely have weight and length data. We have for subsets, small subsets of the animals, more stuff. We've got variety measuring, scrotal size for a while. I don't actually have that data set, but we know the tooth eruption patterns. But we definitely have weight.
And so following up on that, so you have a correlation between sociability and aggressiveness, is that right? Between sociability and...
Only for, yes, we do.
That's a
Yes, for this
phenotypic
adult male sample.
That's a phenotypic correlation, right?
Yes.
So have you measured genetic correlations? I mean, is this...
Well, okay, that's another thing that I did. And again, it's sort of hard to know that I didn't present here. I ran a genetic correlation between the sociability index and dominance for the sample as a whole, not just the adult male sample. And there's a very strong genetic correlation. And there's also a bigger maternal contribution. There's a strong genetic correlation, there's also a strong maternal contribution that's bigger than what we have here, indicating that there is overlap.
Some of the same genes are
Yeah,
causing...
either that or it's pleiotropic, which means that there's a gene for rank that then leads you to have more social interaction, or there's a gene for getting you good with females that then leads you to have more rank. We don't know which comes
And how's it
first.
compared to the phenotypic correlation? How does the genetic correlation compare to the phenotypic correlation?
It's very high. my memory is it's about 0.7. And the maternal, I mean, because you get your rank from your mother
Yeah.
for females for life and for males for the early part of life, and surprisingly, that the maternal correlation wasn't higher than the genetic correlation, but the maternal correlation was about good.
It'd be interesting to see whether there was genetic correlations between these things and morphological characters. You know, whether the same thing leads to health, and wealth.
Well,
Big
the,
size.
you see, the thing is the vervets, if they have a low weight is not a problem. High weight, it can be a problem in this particular, colony. So,
So dominance are really bad?
the weight helped a little bit when you're first becoming dominant for these new males that are 6-year-olds because they, they're still getting bulkier. And that was a factor in who's going to become dominant. As you go on, being, getting really big isn't necessarily good. And for the females, the dominance is so, it's so socially inherited that if you happen to be a family that, gets bigger and bigger, then you still maintain your alpha status. But for the females, there's no correlation between rank and size. And there's certainly no, there's nobody who's skinny because they're low ranking. It's just not that kind of a system. There's plenty of food for one, there's no domination of food, and you don't get that real stress-related weight loss that you get in some mechanic colonies. So for the females, the weight is less important. For the males, I believe it's a factor. I can throw in at least some of our, I can certainly throw in weight and length. We have that for everybody.
I wonder if the approach measure, you tell me whether I don't claim to fully understand the nature of the analysis, so you tell me whether the analysis would have already addressed it. But the approach measure doesn't show up, as Joan was suggesting earlier, because the way that you get to be alpha in part is because the gals like you. The way you get the gals to like you is by being sociable and approaching them. Once the gals like you, you're the center of attention, so you don't do a lot of approaching, and they approach you. And so as a consequence, the highest approachers at one phase in life are going to be the lowest approachers at another phase in life, and yet have the highest reproductive success.
Yeah, it does. It does change over time. Also, if males approaching other males, it's not to sit near generally when they're adult males. So they will. These males are probably approaching other males to get them to move out of the way. But we're not coding that as clearly an approach. Yeah, I know it's a complicated thing. If I just used, even if I just used a single measure like groom, that females use grooming more. They use grooming more in their daily relationships than males do. So young boys can have a real good friend, but they don't groom it very much. So that doesn't become the way the measure proceeds through life. That's why I was really quite encouraged by the interclass correlations, because even though you're less likely to initiate and more likely to receive, you still get continuity with the whole measure of your life. Initiate approach is in the sample as a whole is positively correlated with locomotion, which is our measure of activity. So as you become less active, you just have a lower frequency of getting up and moving over to sit someplace else, and you're more likely to receive. But I do like the way the measure puts that together, because I think it captures something that does have continuity, the individual behavior can change.
So if you put age in the model and you control for the effects of age, maybe that would help.
Well, no, that I did in the big model. For the adult males, there is no effective age. Yeah, it's flat. If you look at the, except for the new, if you're controlling out the new male. I also ran the male analyses as the residual of whether you were new or not. The numbers changed a tiny little bit, and all the results were definite. They didn't really change the results. So I thought it was simpler just to keep it straightforward to the data. And once you're alpha and sociable 1 year, you're also likely to be the next year, and that will predict your success and your sociability in the following year. Because once this is established, it tends to be very consistent during the time period that the males are in groups. And then we take them out so they don't mix with the daughter.
I was wondering about the relationship between sociability and measures that you might have of well-being. So you have the measures of anxiety, self-directed behaviors, and things like that. Is it the case that we appear to have less anxiety?
Yes, there's a negative relationship. I'm not so sure I know what to do with that anxiety measure, though. Its heritability is low, and it doesn't correlate. We have measures of cortisol from hair samples, long-term measures of cortisol, because it takes weeks, and you can extract it from the hair, and trying to make sense of cortisol databases. Anybody who thinks high is stress, low is not, is
Not quite that way.
It's not quite that way, and it's interesting because the high-ranking animals have higher cortisol levels. They're more active, they're more energized. I mean, these are not pathological high levels. These are, and if anything, the low ones you might think of them as being suppressed. And the anxiety score wasn't partially because you've got this other thing going on in there, and you're dealing not within an extreme range, but in the anxiety behavior didn't relate well to the
Yeah.
anxiety scores.
I mean, I was wondering because you'd think sort of at first pass, well, maybe you're going to be more content and less anxious when you have higher sociability. But I can also imagine, I can imagine various kinds of interactions where having all these social interactions might lead to higher fitness, but maybe
It could be more stressful.
less
Matter of fact, in
calmness.
the human literature, it's not just social relationships are good for well-being. They've got to be positive social relationships, and negative social relationships in the family can be a huge stressor. And
Right, so you might see, for example, one of the lower ranking individuals, it might not be so good for them to have high rates of being near other individuals. Is that, I mean, because you're measuring the sociability as proximity to, essentially, right, interactions with others.
Right. Well, I also have this percent time solitary measure, which is highly correlated with these more active behavioral interaction measures. And I could put that in there too. It doesn't really change things much, but I just, because it's a different kind of thing, it's a point sample, it's a percent time, I just chose not to include it. But it tells basically the same story.
Go back to the genetics for a moment. This isolate you have is an isolate of a previous isolate.
Right, exactly. It's a double founder effect.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea about the original St. Kitts founding? Was
Well,
it a
the
single
belief
event?
is they came from West Africa, in the region of sort of Cameroon in there, or the Horn of Africa. And it's surprisingly, there's still a lot of variability.
That's the question.
know, we have high heterozygosity on these microsatellites, so there's still variability in the population, even though we've had this double founder. So, like I say, it amplifies what we've got. There's other things that we probably have lost that we just don't exactly know about. But they're doing a dozen primers funded right now to collect vervets throughout Africa and the Caribbean, and they're all going to be included in this sequencing. So we'll be able to figure out if there's, with multiple individuals from each location. So we will be able to figure out if there's how much variability has been lost and how much variability there is across these populations. They're an interesting species from a biomedical standpoint because vervets are natural carriers of SIV, which it doesn't make them sick. And the same virus that you give to a macaque to model AIDS. And so I think people are trying to figure out why is that, and also if population variability might help to give a clue to that, if there's any variability in SIV carriers.
I'm interested in the fact that you found the new immigrant males have lower sociability scores. And because I originally thought on one hand it must be a tough time for the new immigrants, and on the other hand they might try to initiate a lot of relationship with the new members in the new group. So afterwards you mentioned the initiation of a relationship does not correlate with their rank and paternity. And I thought that might explain a little bit why they don't initiate a lot of relationship. But I'm confusing whether the sociability is a course or the result produced by the initiation or the contact with others, and also what the cause and effect of the rank and the sociability.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what happens when males first go into the group? They are chased by coalitions of females. And their best strategy in those first few months is just to try to lay low and not cause trouble. And then they have to work out their dominance relationships with the males, which those approaches don't get counted in this because they're not going over and sitting down. So you've got a major, the survival strategy and the working towards success strategy is not to just try to go right in and make friends with the females, because the females don't trust you. The females have infants. They are concerned about you. They want to make sure that they can control you. There's a possibility of infanticide. Males are bigger and stronger than females, have longer canines, but the females really, have a concerted effort to keep control of the group. So really, the successful strategy for the males is not to just kind of go bouncing in there and saying hi. He's got to lay back and take his time. And the approaches are not necessarily going over to sit down next to a female too. A male can approach a female in ways like to sniff her or muzzle her or to display to her, but not necessarily sitting down next to her. That's way down the relationship line where they're welcome to sit. And the female grooming groups don't want a male to come sit down in the middle of them. So you've got a process that this particular measure, they can be doing a lot of work initiating, in the dominance relationships and evaluating the situation and in order to be able to establish relationships with the females. But these particular measures are suppressed. If females approach them, they usually leave at the beginning. So they don't get receive approaches, they don't get receive grooms until sort of toward the end of the year. Now, I have the data broken down into quarters. So it would be possible to look at the progression in that new measure, which is something that I actually haven't done. There's just too much data. And, and also the reliability of the percent time estimate is less with fewer data points. But actually, I think I will do that. I think I will, for the new male years especially, look at the progress across the 3/4, because that might be very informative.
Any more questions? All right, thank you very much.